Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Double D. Kuhn. I'm the Gallery Director, Manager for Fine Arts Programming. I have the pleasure of hosting this afternoon's talk by Dr. Carol Brash called Chinese Gardens as Sites for Citing, Sightting, Citing, Citing, and Inciting. This talk is presented as part of the CSB SJU Faculty Art Exhibition, now on display until May 20th at the Gretzky Gallery, located in the Benedicta Art Center on the College of St. Benedict campus. Professor Brash will introduce many functions of gardens connected to China, ranging in a time period from the 11th century to the 21st century. This will be a 20-minute talk with 10 minutes reserved for questions and answers. If you're joining us for a Visual Arts FAE, please type in the code that will appear towards the end of this presentation. You will have 5 minutes to do so when the code appears. And if you should have any questions, please do send an email to fae@csbsju.edu. Okay, now I'd like to share with you Carol's bio that is displayed with the other art faculty for the faculty exhibition wall. Okay, here we go. Dr. Carol Brash, professor of Art History and Asian Studies, spent half of her childhood in Idaho, surrounded by mountains, and the other half in North Dakota, surrounded by prairie. This profound shift shaped her lifelong interest in memory and landscape. She completed a BA in Chinese language and literature before living in Taiwan for a year and a half. She returned to Minnesota, where she's now surrounded by trees and lakes, and completed her MA and PhD in art history with a primary emphasis in Chinese art and a secondary emphasis in photography. As an art historian, she is a cultivator of word gardens. I love that. Chinese gardens are her primary area of research. She is currently working on a book on Chinese gardens in the United States and a translation of several 17th century Chinese poems on garden. She particularly enjoys assisting students in discovering connections between their interests, their classes, and their future. And I have witnessed this in action. So I would love for Carol to now share your wisdom with us.
Given over the past. Given over the past. Exhibition, and rather than select one presentation, I've chosen to pull themes from several of the public presentations I've done since the last exhibition 3 years ago. And these themes are closely related to the book that Jill mentioned that I've been working on. And this will truly be a whirlwind as advertised. I'll begin with a representation of an 11th century garden, a garden long lost to the viewers. And through my theme with these homophones of citing, and inciting, I'll try to connect this long lost site to artists and ideas about gardens from the 16th century and also to a very recent garden in Minnesota today. And so a couple of examples of these talks are over the past 3 years. And these are the two that will primarily inform this presentation. Starting with citing. In Chinese gardens and their representations, certain images and themes appear and reappear over time. In some cases, these recreations purport to be imitations of physical gardens. These images may or may not record a site as it actually appeared, but they do reflect the conflation of history, memory, and imagination in the minds of their creators. This conflation may be demonstrated by examining several very different representations of the same garden, the Garden of Solitary Delight. The Garden of Solitary Delight was a small garden built by Sima Guang in 1073 in Sunxian, which is a suburb of Luoyang. And here you can see his name both in pinyin and in Chinese characters and his years, along with a contemporary writer, Li Gefei. And later we'll be talking about Xiu Ying and Wen Zhengming, both from the 16th century. On the map, you can see that Xi'an is in the um, sort of western central portion of China, and that is where Luoyang is as well, and that some of our 16th century artists will be looking at are from southeastern China, from the Suzhou area, and the last garden we'll talk about that's in Minnesota has a connection to Changsha, China, which is here. Sima had retired to Luoyang in 1071. He builds a garden and writes an essay or record and 7 poems about his garden. The majority of his essay describes the 7 sites, which you see listed here, that comprise his garden. Unfortunately, there's no physical remains of the garden. He does give some indication of where each site is in relation to the one before and includes some description of what is in each site. For instance, in the reading hall that you see here, he lists he has 5,000 volumes, and that's about it. And then he moves to the south to the pavilion for playing water, where there's a 3 by 3 square pond fed by 5 streams, which form a tiger's paw. The emphasis is on this water feature. Um, and implicit in the description is the function of the pavilion as a place for viewing and listening to the water. He then moves north from the pavilion where there's a pond with an island, and he says that he plants bamboo there in the shape of a 30-foot jade jue, and he ties the top together, noting that he then creates a fisherman's tent or hut, and he designates this the hut of the angling fisherman. He then moves to the studio for planting bamboo, which is bamboo around a thatched building that has windows and porches, and he doesn't indicate any particular function other than being an escape from the sun and the heat, so primarily for use in summer, we can assume. His 5th site, he moves from north to east and notes that the ground to the east of the pond was divided into 120 small squares. And at the end of this garden, he planted bamboo, which he uses to create a hut. But he also notes that he has carefully labeled all the specimens of plants that he has put into this herb plot. And so he can rely upon his ability to read rather than to visually identify the plants. He moves us to his south to the 6th site, which is a flower garden, and he's careful to note each species represented by 2 specimens. He doesn't mention any arrangement of the flower beds in any particular way, or any discussion of the aesthetics, only that there are the 2 specimens. He notes that north of this garden, he puts in a pavilion for watering flowers. And the last site is the terrace for seeing mountains. And he once again situates the reader back in his city of Luoyang and reminds us that it's not far from the mountains, but that the mountains aren't visible due to the trees. So he gives this as his reason for building a terrace and pavilion from which one can contemplate distant sights. He doesn't open his record of his garden with a description of it. He doesn't even actually mention the garden at all initially. Instead, he quotes from Mengzi that enjoying oneself is not so good as enjoying oneself with others, but that such joys are for princes and eminent men and not for the poor and those of lowly rank. End quote. He links himself to these revered figures by connecting his choices to their ideas. Sima goes on to link each site with a historical figure in each of the 7 poems following the essay. And I won't go into detail for each of these, but you can see here the historical figure that is connected with each of these sites. This brings us to inciting. Sima had retired to Luoyang in 1071 after the new policy reforms of Wang Anshi, which won favor at court. And Sima was a leader of a conservative faction. And when the emperor chose to implement the new economic policies, which Sima's faction opposed, it was clear that he was no longer in favor. Or another way of looking at it is that he was protesting the changes, so that leaving the court was acting the part of a good Confucian. While he was away from court, he constructed his small garden, and he used his garden as a setting from which to complete the writing of one of the great histories of China, the Comprehensive Mirror for the Aid in Government. Although he and the emperor continued to disagree on some matters of policy, the emperor supported Sima's history project. Everything about the garden harks back to the traditions that Sima had espoused at court. While the court was no longer upholding tradition properly, in his opinion, he delineated a space, his garden, in which tradition reverberated. In this space, he wrote a guidebook for rulers based on his conservative reading of tradition. So he records 2 gardens, one that's a physical garden of beauty, relief from heat, and relaxation, and the other is a symbolic garden of escape from and commentary upon political life. Since he builds the garden after his fall from eminence at court, he calls it the Garden of Solitary Delight. He connects himself to sages in his sites of the garden, since these paragons of propriety seem to support the idea of a simple life. And through this, Sima is able to validate his own choice to retire and find pleasure in his garden alone. Although Sima Guang, the Song dynasty official who built this garden, has remained in the canons of history because of his text, the disappearance of his site uh, meant that there was very little in the visual archive until 2 artists of the Ming dynasty, Qiu Ying and Wen Zhengming, reimagined his garden. These additions to the visual archive indicate that the texts about Sima's garden were still being read in the mid-16th century. The circulation of these images keeps this garden present. The long life of this garden is due at least in part to the strata of references to history and memory built into the original physical garden and its subsequent incarnations. So here you see one of the 2 Ming Dynasty representations of this garden, and you would read it starting from the top here, right, where we actually start not with the library as Sima Guang does, but with a pavilion for playing water, and then we move to the library, to the hut of the angling fisherman, the herb plot, the pavilion for playing with flowers or for watering flowers, and then the terrace for viewing distant mountains. So, how does this match up to what you might have been imagining when you were reading the descriptions earlier? Here are the various sites, and I will scroll through them so that you can see that he's gone out of order from the text. But it's possible that he may have been following the directions in the text. You'll also notice that Sima Guang is featured in each of these space cells. So he's repeating, so Cho-Ying repeats this image throughout the hand scroll. We also have the presence of a crane here to indicate the presence of an immortal. In the last image from the Ming Dynasty we'll be looking at by Wen Zhengming, we get to, again, our inciting. Wen Zhengming's contribution to the canon of the Garden of Solitary Delight was created in 1558, near the end of his life, as Sima had retired to protest actions at court. Wen also retired to remove himself from a court environment that did not match his sense of Confucian ethics. It may be that this similarity in their situation attracted him to this topic. Wen's panoramic version of the garden evokes the quiet refuge of a reclusive scholar surrounded by wilderness. A sloping willow branch and the continuation of a fence along the left diagonal lead the viewer through the woods to a more open space in the second third of the painting. The fences and buildings nestled into the trees and hills signal a transition to human space. A shift to more diluted ink, as well as a strongly vertical pine growing alongside a diagonal brook, indicate this metamorphosis from wilderness to refuge. So again, we see barely, you can see Sima Guang framed here in the window and a servant bringing him some books. So a quite different view of the garden. And in gardens, in the physical presence of gardens, of course, there in the records are both these overviews and these site-by-site renditions, as we saw for Cho-Ying. After this 16th century flurry of interest in the Garden of Solitary Delight, there doesn't seem to be a lot of engagement with the archive of this garden, although in the mid-19th century, Prince Gong, who negotiated treaties with England, France, and Russia following the Opium War of 1860, builds a peak that he calls Du Le Peak at his palace. Like Sima and Wen, he also faced challenging court politics and also appropriates this symbol of the recluse and brings it out from the garden archive. This is particularly important to note as we, in the present, try to reconstruct the past, which is where my more recent work is focused. Today's garden designers face the challenge of making these gardens physically, visually, and intellectually accessible to viewers who are not trained in the Chinese classics, nor in the history of Chinese art. But the need for a space of solace in a time of political turmoil and a desire to create a legacy for the future is as apt today as it was for Sima Guang. So this quote that I'm asking you to consider here was made in reference to a particular minority of scholars, but I ask you to consider it with those individuals or groups who wish to construct a Chinese-style garden on U.S. soil. Some of my more recent work examines tracts of American real estate that have been transformed into representations of China. Or have they? Each serves a specific function at their specific site and also creates and perpetrates symbolic meaning that goes beyond the individual site to connect to other sites past and present. They're reinterpreting the archive to create a new canon. The following examples demonstrate changes and continuations in function and meanings, changes that have occurred since they were first conceived and continue to occur. Although there are around a dozen sites, I will focus only on one today. And so here you can see a list of the dozen sites and a few examples, local one in Minneapolis, one in Portland, and another in California. I have talked about these in other places, So today I would like to focus on the Liu Mingyuan. The idea of a Chinese garden has been migrating west for hundreds of years in various forms. The writings of Matteo Ricci, the designs of William Chambers, the Chinese fence at Monticello, the plethora of willowware patterns, kung fu films. A number of actual gardens have been cultivated here in the United States, and most of these gardens have received little critical attention, although a few recent constructions have received attention in the press. And initially, the term classical Chinese garden was used by sponsoring institutions in how they identified these gardens. Most still call more attention to the features that are created in China or by Chinese artisans, but are becoming more willing to address some of the more hybrid features. Some even embrace the hybrid nature of their site. For some, including my primary example, there is a commitment to preserve, recreate, and sustain the past, but there's an equal commitment to the people of today. Some of these institutions are also addressing the archival nature of the garden by applying new forms of annotation to reach new audiences, but the success of these projects is not yet clear. Here are a few key points to keep in mind. As you all know, gardens are constantly in a state of transformation. They're an ephemeral art form. And since they're in constant flux, preservation is not possible in the usual sense. Even though they may have a long history, even the classical gardens in China today are relatively recent constructions, or perhaps citations of the past. The designers of these reconstructions have attempted to preserve traditional materials, designs, and workmanship, but these are living gardens and cannot be the same gardens lived in by the original inhabitants of the site. The creators of today's Chinese gardens in the United In recent sites, history is accessed and layered differently. Each garden arose to fulfill a different need for a different type of institution, and yet each is called a Chinese garden. There is a set of objects and ideas that are present in each site that link them to the claim of Chinese garden: rocks, plants, views, architecture, connection to other arts. There are in some cases other overlapping concerns that are not related to being a Chinese garden, but rather to being located in the United States in the 21st century. Accessibility, safety requirements, education of a diverse public. Both types of commonalities obscure the fundamentally different additional functions of each site. Most of these sites have incorporated some form of didactics to increase the accessibility of their sites to a broad audience. All have definite, useful pedagogical applications depending on the level of the learner. All help give the site meaning and to create a collective memory of the site. In this site, you see here the architects Jun Feng Fan and Yo Hua Wen, and their plan for the site that is being built in Phelan Park now. This is a site that connects both Chinese Americans and Hmong Americans, since the sister city of St. Paul is Changsha, China, which is also claimed as the ancestral home of the Hmong people. These sites demonstrate the use of traditional forms to shape contemporary identities. In these examples, the authenticating details emphasize a Chinese identity for the garden, yet the alterations to the form, the diverse functions, and the necessity for community building illuminate a much more complicated identity, struggling to integrate other memories and histories. There's a growing body of sites that, with some careful critical analysis, could be useful as both a way of understanding the past and understanding the evolution of the present. In closing, let me leave you with this annotation inked by Wen Zhengming upon seeing a painting that he'd viewed with his master long before and was seeing for the first time since his master had died. How can I bear this feeling of past and present? As the past looks upon the past, so will the future look upon the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm soaking it up. Hey, how is your book progress coming along with this? I'm sure ever it's ever flowing. Of course, I'm asking you this. I realize that this comes out of my mouth at a time when you're just trying to finish up this semester and this year.
Yeah, well, it for a long time I thought I was writing a different book. I started off thinking I was going to write a more sort of academic book, and then a few years ago shifted tact completely and decided I have this class I teach and I need a textbook for it, and I need something that's going to be accessible, to my students. And then was talking to some people who through Chinese immersion schools and other educators who are maybe interested in using some of the local sites. And I thought, well, I really need something that can be used by all of these different educators, right? That would be of interest to all of them. And so that's where I've shifted my focus. And then, of course, a couple of new gardens came up, so I'm still trying to get, and there were a few that I was supposed to get to, and then COVID happened. So I'm hoping to see a few more and collect a little more information before I wrap things up. But that's where I'm at. Not as far as I want it to be because I shifted gears, but I'm excited about what I'm doing.
Yeah. Shifted gears in a lot of different ways.
Right.
So the book will be one that you will use in your class, and then it will be available to other universities as well as other historians and just colleagues.
Yeah, well, ideally, I would like there to be activities in an appendix that would be designed for high school and elementary and have them meet the Minnesota standards for art education so that art teachers who might not be knowledgeable about China could take that and just run with it.
That would be excellent. Absolutely. And then especially, having the Minneapolis Institute of, is it the one that's in Minneapolis? I'm sorry, I just zonked out if it was.
Well, there are actually three. There are three. Well, and a fourth one was proposed, but there's not a site for it right now. But right now, the one that I focused on today is the one that's in St. Paul in Phelan Park. And then there is one in the Minneapolis Institute of Art that's been there for quite some time that is, I would call it an installation rather than a garden. But it is there was a site that was being torn down in China. And so they were able to save some of the pieces from a couple of different sites actually, and then put together a scholar studio and then a small courtyard garden. And they have some silk plants in there and so forth. And sometimes they have piped in cricket chirping and birds, but that's not always working. And then the Minnesota Arboretum down in Chanhassen has started a construction on a Chinese garden a few years ago, but I know that they've been sort of in a holding pattern there. The first phase is done, so you can go see that, but there's like a lot more that they want to do. And then there was another one proposed in Minneapolis for the site that is across the street from the park that's right across the street from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. But since that is one of the few green spaces so close to the inner city, that was deemed to, despite, it'd be great because it's close to the museum, it would not be great for the local people there.
Wow. I have to ask you, and you kind of, a question that I've been asking throughout our live stream visual art season is how COVID, the pandemic, has affected you as an art historian, or how it connects with your topic today.
Well, interestingly enough, about the day, I think it was like the day I got back from yet another, there's so few conferences that focus on what I do. And there had been a small symposium out at the Huntington again, and I had been out and seen some people I'd presented with in the past, and it was great. We all got together. So it was like a Spaniard, a French woman, a Scottish woman, me, all crammed into a cab with a Chinese driver speaking Chinese. He thought it was strange that we could all converse with him.
A
And then,
unique
yeah,
experience
yeah.
indeed.
And then the next, I fly home, I get off the plane, and the state shuts down, right? And that was pretty much the last sort of scholarly thing that I did, right? That I mean, um, and I had some plans for travel and, like I said, other sites I needed to see. So it's definitely impacted my ability to sort of move forward on some of those things. But looking for the silver lining, because everybody was online, I got to attend so many wonderful presentations and talks and things all over the world that I could never have afforded to go and see in person, all of those wonderful things that I saw or had the time, right,
Right.
to do that because of the travel and so forth. So that was, I guess, looking for the positive side. But also just the drain of it all, right? Also, just not like many of my students, right? Not feeling as motivated as I normally do, right?
Mhm.
And that's been hard um, to sort of keep plugging, moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
And I will say, because of all the negativity around it starting in China,
yes,
and then more recently, a lot of the Asian hate crimes against Asian Americans that's been happening. I think that this is such an important thing, right? To create these spaces and represent this part of American history that is so underrepresented in all the other parts of American life, and that gardens is one way that we can increase that visibility, um, and encourage people to learn more, right, about um, the contributions of Asian Americans.
yes, and in a really no pun intended, grounded situation, whereby I think COVID also saw, especially throughout the United States, that we got out and we did more things because being outside and in the company of others was masked,
Mhm.
was as close as we could get, or so many people were walking and going to parks as much as they could, um, by themselves or with a loved one or their families. And so to have this opportunity to experience that, and then also just become more informed about the historical features, that these particular parks, especially in Minneapolis, are offering us, and more, is, well, we just have to make it relatable,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that does. I have to ask you, if you are a gardener.
I'm a gardener wannabe. My daughter, who's sitting behind me, is probably laughing because I anything that comes in the house dies for sure. Just black thumb. Yeah, she's laughing. Um, but the but out of doors, right? I have quite a gigantic yard, as my neighbors, can attest to. And I'm basically, it's a full-time job once the snow melts, and so I'm always out there. I have plans for what I would love to do in my retirement. Right now, it's just sort of staying on top of it so that it's not an eyesore. But I do have plans, and I got a bunch of rocks. From they were doing some construction near my near my husband's apartment, and he brought me a bunch of rocks that they were getting rid of. And so my big plan this summer is to create all kinds of sort of rock formations in various places in my garden, in gardens. I have little beds around the yard. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. My students who are in my Chinese and Japanese garden class right now just had to do little practice rock formations. So, so they know it's a real thing. I make them do it.
Well, you could take this a step further and have them actually, if only class was going on for a couple more weeks, you
Right.
could have them,
Yeah.
implement some of these techniques in your backyard.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I need a water feature, but
Yes. Yeah.
but yeah, no, and that was the other hard thing about, speaking of COVID, right, was that normally I would take the students on field trips to see these sites down in the cities, and of course wasn't able to do that this year, which was just heartbreaking. But was able to sort of sneak in a few hands-on activities that I like to do with this class. So yeah.
Well, that's what I've always admired about your classes as well, that you really do, from the bit of observation and some of the gallery assistants that I've worked with who have had you as their professor, it is the combination of the lecture and also the hands-on and the group work. And I'm really happy that you were able to share some of your passion with us today, because it certainly shows through. And, just the specializing of that material that you'll continue to share with us in a textbook. And then you mentioned also translation of poems about gardens, and that will be a separate book that you're working on.
Probably an article. We'll see. It's a series of poems actually from the 16th century, and they've been translated before, but I feel the need to. Okay, this is a long story. I discovered that they had been translated and then printed in this book in 1923, and for each one of them and an image that goes with it, this woman who I'm trying to find out more about, but she's apparently from New York, and when she was a college student, she wrote a couple of art critique pieces in the New York Times. And anyway, I'm trying to find out why she got involved with this project and why she felt compelled to write these sort of prefaces. And I'm assuming that there's an intention that this was for an American audience. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure what they're doing there. But I want to translate the poems myself to see if it brings up something that might help me connect better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a question that this will be probably our last question for today, and I'm not sure if you're able to see it.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So about the idea of the title, that was kind of me being a smarty pants, right? Because I was trying to figure out. I was asked to do a presentation, and I was looking through the presentations that I'd done in the last 3 years and trying to figure out how I could, take like 4 hours of stuff and put it into 20 minutes. And so, kind of
like this whole year, like
it's like the block system, right? Yeah. And so then I thought, because what I tell my students all the time about Chinese gardens is that they teach you how to see, because it's all about sight. You're both the architecture both frames sites for you to see, and yet it is also designed in a way to be part of a site that you see from elsewhere in the garden. And so that idea of, sort of citing had been in my mind because I was preparing for that class. And then, of course, citing with the C, because they're always referencing history. And then I think right around that time when I was thinking about this, there had been the rally in St. Paul against the hate crimes against Asian Americans. And And some people who were involved with, local gardens were, of course, a part of that. And so it just made me think about, the political is still very much a part of gardens even today. And so it just sort of popped into my head. And me, I like puns.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I enjoyed the cleverness of it, and on several different levels. So
Yeah, and so I thought, well, I can just pull those three
yeah,
things from these variety of projects that I've been working on and sort of present them together. So that's what I did, sort of.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Carol, for sharing this with us, and everyone who joined us today. And also just to remind people that this is an extension of the faculty art exhibition that's up at the Gretzky Gallery at St. Ben's, and that is up through May 20th. So you have a couple more weeks to see that if you haven't had a chance to. And also the senior art thesis exhibition called SOAR. Its last day is tomorrow. So you have until 4:00 tomorrow. And I know some professors have been bringing their classes in to see the show as well. And that's been wonderful. So this is the last visual art event of our season. And in the fall, I never would have guessed we would have gotten this far. It was touch and go, as you know. And all I can say is we did it. We did it. We stayed in the focus and on campus and variations of that, so that we could indeed have our year of 2020-21 at CSBSJU, and we'll be graduating our seniors this Saturday and Sunday. So I just want to thank everybody at CSBSJU, whether in the classroom or in support and every other different way, that worked with so hard and with compassion and kindness through the frustrations to make it work. So thank you all again for tuning in today and for tuning into other live stream artist talks we've had. And Carol, thank you. You're a gem. And I hope that everyone has a lovely evening and has an opportunity to enjoy some gardens, a lot of gardens, your own or walking through and visiting another this summer.
Yes.
Okay. Goodbye. Thank you.